Hi. Um, Today we're going to talk about de-individuation. So the question is, what would you do if you knew that no one would ever find out what you did? You would never be held accountable or responsible, and you would never ever get caught. What would you do? Typically, when I ask this question, uh, the typical answers often are, I would rob a bank. I would uh, kill someone that we don't like. We would donate money, we would help others. And so when we talk about um, doing something when no one else would find out, we can identify that behavior into three components. We can actually call it antisocial behavior, which is behavior that is meant to harm others. We can categorize it as normative behavior, behavior that, yeah, we would do. It's out of the norm, but it doesn't hurt anybody. And then we can classify it as pro-social. And pro-social behavior is behavior meant to help others. Okay, so why are we talking about what you would do? Well, we are talking about the process of de-individuation. And de-individuation is when we lose our self-awareness, our self-restraint. It typically occurs in groups, situations that foster anonymity. So typically, we see individuals who will behave a certain way when they are in a group that would never um, do something um, do that behavior if they were on their own. Okay, this explains mob mentality. This explains riots and how people behave in a riot, where they are pretty much given free range to do whatever they want, knowing that they will not be held accountable. And they just get caught in the moment. Okay, self-awareness. When we talk about the loss of self-awareness, is being aware of the different aspects of ourselves, what including our traits, what we do, what we feel, okay, how we see ourselves as a person. Okay, essentially, it is a psychological state in which oneself becomes the focus of attention. So when you lose that self-awareness, you lose a sense of who you are, and you begin to behave in ways that um, you wouldn't necessarily would if you were following kind of like your moral compass. Okay. So there was a very famous study, and this is one of the ones that we were going to talk about in class. It is deemed to be one of the most unethical experiments in the history of psychology, and it was performed by a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. And back in 1971, he wanted to know if prisons were full of evil people or if prisons made normal, well-behaved, well socialized people evil. Okay. And so he ran this experiment in the basement of Stanford University, and the experiment was supposed to last 14 days. However, because of the results and how people began to behave, he had to stop it after 6 days. So the experiment was he took uh, well-adjusted um, young adults, and he created a prison in the basement of Stanford, and he divided the people basically with the toss of a coin as to who was going to be a prisoner and who was going to be a um, a guard. And he gave guards free range as to they could do whatever they wanted to make sure that the prisoners were behaving. The only thing is that they couldn't use physical violence. Okay, and so I won't go too much into detail because I have attached a video that explains the entire experiment. But ultimately, what he found out is that when the guards were given power, it corrupted them that within 6 days they began to do such sadistic acts and treated the prisoners in such ways that were so dehumanizing, they were so degrading, that he had to stop it after 6 days. And so, what we learned from this experiment, and we can attach this experiment to many things that have happened, is that when people are given power and they become de-individuated, they will do things that they would typically wouldn't do. Now, this was an extension of Milgram's experiment. He was talking about obedience, but he took it a step further. So I'll let you watch the video. It is quite interesting. There has been a movie made out of it. It's very Hollywood. I don't recommend the movie. I recommend the documentary that I have posted. Okay. Um, Also, the during the war in Iraq in 2000, back in 2000, what was found was that the American soldiers were so cruel and degrading to the prisoners of war that this was actually taken up all the way to the courts, because it was so horrific what they did to these prisoners. And when we talk about this experiment of Stanford and when we talk about the individuation, we can explain how these things can happen. Okay, so what does the individuation really mean? Well, basically, there's a process and there are factors that need to be present for someone to become de-individuated. Okay, so the first one is diffuse responsibility. So when you're in a group, um, if everybody's doing the same thing, you are less likely in your mind to be held as responsible for your acts because everyone else was doing it. Okay, so there's that diffuse responsibility that I don't need to change. Look at everyone else. Everyone else is doing it. It's not up to me. Okay. Then there's the physical anonymity. If you cannot be recognized, if you are able to hide, if you're able to blend, again, you can't be held accountable. And so it just kind of gives you that free range. It kind of takes away all the societal restraints that we have that helps us behave in a certain way in a society. If that's taken away, it's kind of free range for you to behave in whichever way that you like. There's the decreased self-awareness where um, you stop seeing yourself as who you are, and you start to look at everyone else and behave in that way. You stop um, you don't see yourself as you really are. So you stop being aware of what your usual behaviors would be, what your traits are, what your feelings are. Okay. There's the factor of group presence. Okay. The bigger the group, the more people around, the more likely that you will become de-individuated. And this can be explained through riots, right? When we look at riots and when we look at, for example, the Vancouver riots, people behaved in horrific ways. And these were people who, on a day-to-day basis, were regular citizens, but given that crowd size, given the decrease responsibility. Everyone else is doing it. You were not going to be recognized. They did things that they burned cars, they attacked people, they robbed places. Um, so things that, again, you wouldn't do otherwise. And the fifth one is the response to situational cues. So you start to look around and what's going on around you. What are people doing? How are they behaving? What is going on? And you start to take your cues from that and you behave in such a way. Okay. So one of the biggest, in my opinion, one of the biggest examples of de-individuation would be cyberbullying. Here we have someone who can hide behind a camera, who does not need to show their face. They can create a new account, so there's anonymity. They see other posts, they see other people doing the same thing, so there's no responsibility there. Um, they may put a post up and it feels good to say something that they normally wouldn't do, and because they don't see the repercussions, maybe they lose self-awareness and they begin to write horrific things. Um, right? The group, the size, you can see how many people are involved, how many posts there have been in the thousands and the millions. So it's a big size. And then you start to respond to those situational cues that, well, this is what people do online. This is, I'm seeing it on the news. People are doing this, right? People shouldn't be dressing a certain way if I don't like them to be dressed in that way. So I'm going to put my 2 cents in and I'm going to make comments. Okay. So cyberbullying is a perfect example of de-individuation. The Iraq War, what happened um, in Abu Ghraib back in 2000 would be a perfect example, and the Stanford prison experiment would be an example of de-individuation.